So, um, oops. Yesterday we covered counterculture, and that's what the bell ring was about. Hopefully, you had time to complete the culture slides assignment. I see 5 of you have turned it in already. Good. You had to pick one of the two slideshows and submit 5 to 7 sentences about the most significant points and include at least 3 of the topics in that list. But the notes today will cover protests. And from the reading, I think you can gather that there are a wide variety of topics that were covered in the late 60s, early 70s in the United States. So let's look at some of those. And generally, it was thought of as a revolution because we were changing the way that the country looked at a variety of issues. And going back to the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson believed that every generation needs a revolution. And so this would be the baby boomers. And indeed, for the previous generation, the Great Depression and World War II had led to significant change, and it would be the counterculture movement that would see the same for the baby boomers. One thing being questioned was the significance of the traditional, or sometimes called nuclear family, for a couple of reasons. One was the traditional role of the woman. Starting in World War II, women had been encouraged to work outside the home, although sometimes the emphasis fell away after a while. And so you started to see people shift their attitudes because everybody can remember that, of course, their mothers had helped work during World War II, making munitions and other war supplies. So why not change the tide on that again? That, coupled with the availability of birth control, meant that women didn't necessarily have to focus on having children as much. This kind of ran counter, as part of the counterculture, of the images that people saw in TV shows and advertising, where the father, of course, was the leader of the household and made all the decisions, epitomized in one of the popular TV shows in the 50s, which was literally called Father Knows Best. And so that kind of changed the outlook exactly of where women were placed inside the household. The other one, of course, would be as women gained more independence, it also meant that they did not have to stay married if they didn't want to. And so divorce started to increase. And that also changed the nature of families. And you actually started to see that accepted in some popular TV shows, although they did it through a much more bland version. The Brady Bunch, both the lead characters, they were widowed. But you started to see greater acceptance of step families as well. And then, of course, the model for all of the revolutionary activities would be the civil rights movement. It showed that civil disobedience or peaceful protest could lead to change in things like laws. And in fact, as we mentioned before, Martin Luther King, toward the end of his life, before he was assassinated, started to look at other topics besides just civil rights, like poverty, for instance. So many other groups of people were influenced by King and the civil rights movement, such as women's groups, environmentalists, consumers, and so on. All the different groups that were talked about, for instance, in the reading. So many other groups are influenced by civil rights. So let's look at the women's movement first. As I mentioned earlier, many had entered the workforce during World War II, but also an increasing amount were also getting a college education. Despite these things, women still lagged behind when it came to employment and salaries. Teaching, for instance, the whole way up until the 70s, if you're a woman, especially if you got pregnant, you were expected to leave the profession. And so these kind of attitudes continued for a period of time. And there you can see up on the graph, the orange or yellowish line is the percentage of women with a college degree. The blue line is for men, and you can see about in the early 90s, they crossed each other. Now, women make up the majority of college graduates. And when it comes to pay, there still is a little bit of a difference between the two, but you can see it's been narrowing. And of course, this chart only goes up to 2002. Probably the biggest factor that, and the reason why there's still a gap, is because women still are more likely to take time off for children and family, for instance. That puts their lifetime earnings lower than men. But there would, of course, be people that would advocate for greater rights for women. And probably the leader of this would be Betty Friedan, which is spelled Friedan. Betty Friedan, Friedan. And she wrote the book The Feminine Mystique. And feminine is Feminine. And then, what's that?
On the women's rights slide, there's like where it says women were expected to be at home caring for the families in a really small, tiny print.
I'm sure it is. And Mystique is spelled Mystique. And so this push for the equality of women politically, economically, and socially. Politically, economically, and socially. Politically, that's a little bit easier because obviously women have already been granted the right to vote. Uh, However, the larger expectation that women also make up an equal amount of office holders, for instance, half of Congress, half of governors, that still lags behind, mostly because of the reasons I mentioned earlier, that women take time off in order to have children and raise a family. But obviously, a political career takes a long time. You start off with something like city council or school district and work your way up. And if you've taken time off to have children, then obviously you're not going to be able to get necessarily to the same level. And then economically, that can be sometimes difficult because men are more likely to take dangerous jobs, would often pay more. And social equality, though, is cultural, and that can certainly be changed. Betty Friedan also helped organize the National Organization of Women, or National Organization for Women, excuse me. The National Organization for Women, which is the main civil rights group for that particular gender. And this organization, commonly known as NOW, would demand equal pay. So if you have a man and a woman doing the same job, then they should get the same pay as long as they have the same amount of experience and so on. So equal pay. And they also wanted to highlight sex discrimination. So when women were discriminated against in the workforce, maybe made to follow certain rules, for instance, that men weren't expected to, they chose to highlight these types of unjust activities. And of course, this eventually led to a few different things. One of them was the court case Roe versus Wade, which we'll talk more about later, which legalized abortion in the United States. And the other one was the push for the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, which basically said that women would be equal. It was just a very simple passage and amendment to the Constitution, but it ended up not getting enough states, and so it never became official. What's that?
Another woman.
Another woman? Yes, actually. Her name was Phyllis Schlafly. She was anti-feminist. She basically said the ERA shouldn't be passed for the following reasons. And you don't have to type all these down, but one of them was, if you pass this, women will be drafted. And she is one of the people that thinks that women shouldn't serve in the military. I think she might have recently passed away, actually. They don't think women should serve in the military. I was listening to a similar woman commentator talking about this. It was about sexual abuse in the military, and she basically said, what do you expect? Women will be raped if they serve alongside men. So they have a very antiquated attitude toward it. She also believed that the language basically said that, I can't remember it exactly, but it said there would be no discrimination on the basis of sex. So she said, if you do this, then homosexuality will be legalized. Well, that eventually happened anyway. So a lot of the predictions she made scared a lot of people into backing off their support. And here we can see the map in here somewhere. The states that ratified are in green, and the states that did not are in yellow. And you do need, of course, 3/4 of states in order to pass. So that was not enough in order to become part of the Constitution. And the last thing I want to mention today would be the environment. One of the big concerns was non-renewable resources, coal, oil, natural gas. And the other would be pollution. So non-renewable resources and pollution would be the two big concerns. Science offered an alternative to all this: nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is one of the cleanest forms of energy production, except for, of course, the waste, which lasts sometimes thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And after 3 Mile Island happened, which we talked about earlier in the course, not a lot of people were eager for a nuclear power plant to be built close to their home. And so there are a number of nuclear power plants in the country, as you can see up on the map there, mostly along the East Coast, where there's a greater need because of the population. But there haven't been a lot of new ones built more recently because of the reason that I just mentioned. And probably, if you could pick Betty Friedan as the most influential person in feminism, the most influential one in the environment was Rachel Carson. And Rachel Carson wrote the book Silent Spring, which talked about things like DDT, which we've already mentioned. And DDT was a widely used pesticide, and a lot of people believed it was completely safe. They would even show photographs of them spraying towns with it, and children run out and play in it as they were spraying it along. So that was probably not a good idea. But because of the decimation it caused in more sensitive animals, like birds, for instance, eventually DDT was banned in the United States. In fact, let me show you that. On the right hand side is an advertisement. And if you can read it all, it says, "Protect your children against disease carrying insects. Trims DDT children's room wallpaper." So, wallpaper coated with DDT that you could put up in their room. Yeah, so that was nice. And obviously, of course, that was made illegal. And so eventually, Earth Day was created, which is the one day when people can pretend they care about the Earth. And also, the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, the main policing agency for the environment, Environmental Protection Agency. And then the other thing would be the passage of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. The Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. And of course, the problem with the Clean Air and the Clean Water Act is the same with any other regulation. The more laws a business has to follow, the less likely they are to expand or hire employees. And so the big debate has always been, which do we do more? Do we protect jobs or do we protect the environment? So that's all the notes for today. For the remainder of the class, please use the time to finish up the culture slides or the reading that we started yesterday in the remainder of class. Plus, if there's anything from the Unit 9 and 10 review week that you didn't finish, the study guide or the project, or maybe you didn't do the essays. There are some people that bizarrely didn't do the essays. Make sure that you complete those.